82 for a high standard. Time now 11 o'clock.
And good morning. This is MPR News. I'm Mike Mulcahy. It's Friday. That means the topic is Minnesota politics. With 11 days to go until the August 14th primary, Minnesotans have a choice to make. That choice is which candidate will be on the ballot in November. The primary will decide that, and there are contested races in both the Republican Party and the DFL Party for that chance to run for governor. On the Republican side, the party endorsed Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson. But former Governor Tim Pawlenty is challenging him for the nomination. And only one will be left after Republicans have their say in the primary. Both Jeff Johnson and Tim Pawlenty are here in the UBS Forum today as part of our Meet the Candidate series for their first broadcast debate of the campaign. Thanks, both of you, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
There aren't a lot of ground rules today. We'll skip the opening statements. We'll try to give you both enough time to speak your piece. And I'll give you a chance to wrap up at the end, too. And we won't take calls, although I did ask listeners to send in some questions, and they did, and we'll get to some of those as our time goes on. But because this is a choice, I'd like to start with some of the things you've been saying about each other. And Tim Pawlenty, let me start with you. You ran an ad, a TV ad. It said, Jeff Johnson, quote, is a career politician who taxes and spends a lot. How do you back that up?
Well, I will back that up in just a second, but let me first thank you and MPR for hosting this debate, and thanks to Jeff for running and being a formidable opponent. I appreciate him. I know public service and running for campaigns isn't easy on candidates and their families, but it's important. So I want to thank MPR and Jeff for everybody being here today. Beyond that, in terms of the ad that we ran relative to Jeff, it makes three basic claims. The first is that Jeff proposed a property tax increase in Hennepin County. That's indisputable. He did. The Democrats proposed 4-point-some% increase. He proposed a 3% increase. So that's true. He proposed via an op-ed a certain support for then Governor Dayton's tax increase plan or tax plan. Jeff didn't embrace all of it, but he embraced parts of it, so we referenced that in the ad as well. And then the third piece is that he embraced parts of Obamacare, and that's also true. So, the point of the ad was if you're going to hold yourself out as the ideal conservative or the perfect conservative, and you're not, then that looks hypocritical, and we wanted to point that out to voters so they know that going into the primary next week.
Jeff Johnson, response?
Well, it was the most dishonest ad I've seen in politics, and I've been doing this for a few years, and I believe KSTP gave it a D+, which I thought was generous, and CCO said it had one either false or misleading statement every 2.5 seconds, and the ad stayed on for 2 weeks. Tim, you're still sending out letters making the same false allegations. I have a 95% rating with the Taxpayer League, lifetime rating, which is one of the highest in history, much higher than Tim's as well. And I think this is just kind of old school politics. This is strategy from 10 or 20 years ago, which is you're not out there engaging with voters. You're sitting in a room raising money, and then you spend the money to attack your opponent, and in this case, in a very dishonest way. So it's disappointing.
Well, let me ask about something you said. You said Tim Pawlenty is a bigger disappointment, or was a bigger disappointment as governor to conservatives than Arnie Carlson. Seriously?
Absolutely, because Tim campaigned as a conservative and governed in many ways as a moderate, whereas Arnie campaigned as a moderate to liberal, and he governed as a moderate to liberal. And I think that is, one of the differences between Tim and me. I'm campaigning as a conservative, and I will govern that way.
Tim Pawlenty, you can respond to that.
Jeff Johnson is a poser. He pretends that he's for all these things, that he's going to get all these things done, but he's been in politics most of his adult life, and he's actually accomplished none of them. So he had a chance to do things like abolish the Met Council. He authored more than 300 bills when he was in the legislature. Not one of them proposes abolishing the Met Council. For the things he criticizes me about, he voted for many of them when he was in the legislature. So taking up space and being present as a member of the legislature or a member of the Hennepin County Board is not leadership. If you're going to say that you're the champion of these things and you are the conservative leader, you actually have to do something. You have to do more than take up space or sit in a chair or vote no. If you want to be a leader, you have to accomplish things. And if you look at my record as governor of the state of Minnesota, it's a common sense conservative record. And anybody who looks at that fairly will reach that conclusion. It includes appointing common sense conservative judges, holding state spending down to the lowest level in the modern history of the state, actually reducing overall tax burdens during my time as governor, market-based, not government-based healthcare reforms, cracking down on illegal immigration, work requirements and welfare, and much more. So for anybody to look at that record, and many have, by the way, third-party conservative groups, and say that that's not a conservative record. And by the way, employed or deployed in a liberal blue state, Minnesota, it's a remarkably good record. I'm happy to defend it all day long. But for Jeff to say, he is the champion of the conservative cause in Minnesota, all it is talk. And eventually you got to walk the walk. You can't just talk the talk. And he is a poser in the sense that he talks about these things, but he doesn't do any of them.
Jeff Johnson, all talk.
Yeah, so Tim, I won't call you any names, but one of the reasons that when you got in the race and started to seek the endorsement and went to a lot of the BPOU and congressional district meetings, that you backed out of that was because there's no interest amongst the grassroots. And it is because there's a lot of disappointment in your governorship. That's not to say that you didn't do good things. You did some good things, but you had a chance. You had your opportunity, this privilege for 8 years to just fundamentally reform government in a conservative way.
Which of those did you do, Jeff, in your entire career? Which did you actually accomplish as a legislator
Tim, I've never
or a
been
Hennepin
governor.
County commissioner?
I've never been governor. And you bring up the Met Council, which just blows my mind because you had 8 years to do something about the Met Council. You grew its budget by what, 53, 54%, and $300 million.
And you voted for it.
And there's a big difference between being one of 201 legislators and a governor.
Why didn't
I
you
don't
know
know
then when the Met Council funding came up?
Why
didn't you author a bill to abolish it?
It was probably
because
in one
it's
of
not
the,
leadership.
You're going to let me talk?
All right, I need you one at a time.
It probably was one of the many omnibus bills, which I would consider garbage omnibus bills, that the legislature and you shoved things in so you could put the legislature in a spot where you have to vote for something even if you don't like it.
Boy.
That needs to change.
Talk about mealy-mouthed explanations. Why didn't you author a bill to abolish it?
Hey, Tim, I wasn't governor. Why didn't you
were a
abolish it?
legislator.
Why didn't you scale it back when you had the opportunity that I haven't had
statutorily
yet?
created, Jeff. Legislators
Wait,
can
talk about
propose statutes.
mealy-mouthed.
All right, hang on. Time out. Let's move on to some issues because this is good and it's fun, but I'm not sure if we're shedding a whole lot of light on things. What taxes would you cut if you do become governor? And let's start with you, Jeff Johnson.
So we take too much money from people in Minnesota. I would start with the income tax. And I wouldn't just start at the top rate. That's what we talk about most often, I think, because it's completely out of touch with the rest of the country. But our lowest income tax rate is actually higher than the highest rate in 23 other states. So we're not just taxing to death the CEO in Minnesota. We're taxing to death school teachers and mechanics and bartenders. That, for me, would be the starting point. I also believe that we should end the tax on Social Security benefits because we are one of the very few states that does that. And I would also move to license tab fees, which they're called fees, but they're actually a tax. And while they had been cut back under Ventura, they've gone right back up to where they used to be.
Tim Pawlenty.
Minnesota has the third highest income tax rates in the country. We have the fifth highest overall tax burden. Some studies vary a little bit, but everybody acknowledges that we have really high taxes in the state of Minnesota. There's one governor in the modern history of the state of Minnesota that has moved Minnesota out of the top 10 in taxes. Many candidates have promised. Only one person actually did it, and he's talking to you right now. So I'm proud of my tax reduction record in Minnesota. Beyond that, there's a lot of taxes we should cut. One example that I like is to get rid of taxation on Social Security benefits. Minnesota is in a minority of states that taxes Social Security income. And I think if you work your whole life and you get to the end of your life and you want to enjoy your retirement, the last thing you need is the state of Minnesota coming in and taking some of your hard-earned money in the form of Social Security benefits and taxing it. So I'd like to abolish that.
This is MPR News. You're listening to a debate between Tim Pawlenty, he just spoke, he's the former governor, and Jeff Johnson, he's a Hennepin County commissioner. He has the Republican endorsement for governor. They're facing off in the primary on August 14th, and we're happy to have them here today to hear where they stand on some issues, where they stand on each other, as we've heard already. Let's talk about public employee bargaining rights. When Scott Walker was elected governor of Wisconsin 8 years ago, that was the first thing he did, was to cut back on the ability of public employees to collectively bargain, many groups. Would you do the same in Minnesota, Governor Pawlenty, if you were elected again?
The collective bargaining process is an important process, Mike, and it is established between employee groups and employer groups. The big development that has occurred recently in that regard is a decision that many of your viewers may have heard of called the Janus Decision, decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. That's really the big development in that area. And I think in terms of collective bargaining in the state of Minnesota between public employee unions and state employee unions, that's the big change. But that's not going to be affected by state law. That was a U.S. Supreme Court constitutional decision.
So you think that covers it? You don't need to go any farther than that?
Well, it gives public employees free rights to choose whether they want to be in the union or not in the union and still be able to keep their job, and they don't still have to pay the whole fee. They used to be able to pay just a portion called the fair share fee if they didn't want to be in the union, but now they can pull out of that altogether. And then on the other side of the coin, the unions can still go, get the support of their members, but they have to get their affirmative approval. And again, that's not something the state's going to affect. That's the U.S. Supreme Court deciding that.
Jeff Johnson, what about you?
So I actually grew up in a union household and have been a labor lawyer, or used to be a labor lawyer. I haven't practiced for a long time, and represented both unions and employers in the past. And so I believe in the right to collectively bargain. I actually supported the Janus decision because I also believe that individual workers should have the right to choose whether they're in that union or not, and if they don't want to be, they shouldn't be. The one thing that I would say that we should take a look at is whether there are legislatively created rules or policies in law that give one side or the other an advantage. And I know this is a few years ago, but when I was in the legislature, there were a few rules that unions had gotten put in place with respect to the amount of time you're allowed to negotiate or deadlines that were just kind of pulled out of the blue that give unions an edge. And I don't think that's fair. I think we should try to have a level playing field for everybody. So I would work to at least level the playing field.
All right, guns have been a big issue after several mass shootings in the country. Would you support any new restrictions on the ownership or purchase of firearms, Jeff Johnson?
I would not, and I've been very clear on that. And I say that because everything I have seen isn't going to solve a huge problem that we have in our society right now. And in fact, when we talk about some of these, common ground restrictions or whatever we want to call them, they actually allow us to ignore or sidestep some really difficult issues in society. I don't think changing the age at which someone can buy a semi-automatic weapon or ban a bump stock is going to stop a school shooting. Instead, we have to be talking about these tougher issues, which includes family breakdown. That certainly has something to do with it. It includes mental health issues. It includes policies that we have in some of our schools that say we are not going to discipline in any way kids that are acting out or are actually being violent in school. It ignores the fact that our pop culture is drenched in violence. Those are tough topics, but those are the things we should be talking about rather than new gun restrictions.
Governor Pawlenty.
Well, first of all, I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment and a proud gun owner, and I've always had a strong record of supporting Second Amendment rights. But I do think there are some improvements that we can make that both sides of this heated debate can agree to, and they include the following. One, I do think we should make it clear under Minnesota law that bump stocks are illegal. And for your listeners who don't understand what those are a certain device that you can attach to semi-automatic weapons that turn them into machine guns. Machine guns are already illegal under state and federal law in the United States and in Minnesota, and we should make sure that anything that converts a gun into a machine gun is also illegal. And I think most people support that, including most gun owners, and I think it's a matter of clarifying existing law. Number two, there's been some questions around background checks. And so if you're a licensed gun dealer currently in the United States, you have to run a background check. If you're just gifting somebody or making personal transfers of the ownership of a gun between, say, a grandpa and a grandson or grandma and a granddaughter, we don't want to get in the middle of that. But for people who are selling guns who aren't licensed gun dealers, I don't think we want to require a background check, but I do think we want to offer the background check system available to them. So if they choose to use it, they could then enjoy legal safe harbor if somebody then sues them later. I think that would be an encouragement and incentive for more people to use the background check system. It would add to public safety, and I think it's something both sides could agree on. I also think we want to make sure that mentally ill people who are a danger to themselves or to others and they have due process attached to it, are not able to access guns in a moment where they're having that kind of crisis in life. And then finally, I think we need to beef up our school security, make our schools more physically resilient. I think we also need to make them more resilient in terms of training and the ability to be able to respond to or deter certain types of safety concerns. And we got to beef up our mental health capacity in our state. Whether it's this issue or others, we have a dire lack of counselors and bed space for those who are mentally ill, and we're under-treating the mentally ill in our state.
Well, that segues nicely into a question I got from a listener who said, children and adults with mental illnesses face long wait times for every type of service, and our suicide rate is climbing. What will you do specifically to build our mental health system? And Tim Pawlenty, let's stay with you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important question, Mike, and I think as people see this rise of mental health challenges in our communities and our state, we, I think, can get a bipartisan consensus for building more capacity in this regard. Sheriff Rich Stanek in Hennepin County has been terrific in championing these issues. They have people sitting in the Hennepin County jail who sit there for long periods of time, who are not even yet convicted of a crime, or in some cases even properly accused of a crime, who can't get out of jail because they have no secure mental health beds to go to. So we need to build mental health capacity in terms of our bed space in the delivery system in Minnesota. So the state and counties and others are going to have to fund that. And we're going to have to build our capacity in terms of mental health professionals, more of them being available. And there are some strategies we can use to encourage people into those professions. And then eliminate dumb rules. There used to be a rule, I think it's still on the books, where if you were a hospital, you couldn't have more than 8 mental health beds in the hospital if you took Medicaid dollars. I think Congress may have addressed that, but that shows you how government can do dumb things in terms of restricting. Why would you want to restrict bed space if a hospital wanted to have more mental health bed space? And there's political reasons for that, but I think it was a dumb rule.
Jeff Johnson, what about the mental health system? What would you do?
So it's actually something that I have worked on with Sheriff Stanek and others in Hennepin County. We have a lack of bed space for people with mental illnesses in this state, and it's probably going to require that we spend some money. And I actually believe that state government spends too much money. We've seen a huge increase in spending the past decade or so, and there are areas where we should be actually reducing spending. However, I also think it is important that Minnesota maintains a safety net for our most vulnerable citizens, and I would include in that senior citizens, people with disabilities, and people who are mentally ill. And so this is an area where I would actually agree with Tim that this is probably a bipartisan area where we are making sure that we're building out the capacity to deal with this.
Okay, so you're going to cut taxes and you're going to spend more on mental health. Where are you going to cut spending?
I would start with the Department of Human Services and our human services system, our welfare system in Minnesota. When you see comparisons of 50 state comparisons or comparisons of states that are similar to us and where we fit in different spending categories, Minnesota's kind of in the middle or in the top third in pretty much every category. We're at the bottom in public safety for several reasons, and then we are far above almost anyone else, far, far above almost anyone else in human services spending. We actually spend double per welfare recipient what the national average is, $14,000 per person versus $7,100. And this is because we have created level after level of supports over the past 40 years without ever going back and looking at the old programs and saying, are they actually changing people's lives or not? Are they actually making them self-sufficient? So to me, that's the starting point. There are other areas as well, but that is the biggest area of the budget that I think is ripe for some changes.
Tim Pawlenty, where would you cut state spending?
Let's start by stop wasting money. And we have unbelievable examples just in the last few months of the state wasting hundreds of millions of dollars of money that could be more smartly and more wisely redeployed. Let me give you a couple quick examples. One of the local TV stations highlighted daycare providers in Minneapolis, predominantly Somali daycare providers, allegedly defrauding the state of Minnesota for reimbursements for childcare that they allegedly didn't provide, and then taking a bunch of the money and running it through cash at the Minneapolis airport, sending it to Somalia and funding the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization. If those allegations are true, it could be up to $100 million, which is half the money in the program. We have other examples of the legislative auditor saying that the state of Minnesota is either so incompetent or so incomplete in the way that it verifies eligibility for people trying to enroll in certain state assistance programs that they don't even check, or the checking is incompetent or inaccurate. And the estimates are hundreds of millions of dollars of waste just in that alone. And the list goes on and on, Mike. So just those two examples, even if they're close to accurate, you're approaching $500 million a year or biennium in just those two examples of waste. If you redeployed that into more mental health beds or lowering the insurance for hardworking people who are struggling to keep up with their insurance costs, that would make a big and measurable difference. And there are dozens of those examples.
If you're going to crack down on that fraud and abuse, though, doesn't that actually take more people working for the government? Wouldn't you lose some of your savings there as you try to find who's eligible and who isn't?
Well, if you talk to the people who are on the front lines of doing that checking or not checking, part of it is you have technology failures because the systems are
Costs money
inaccurate,
too, though.
old. Well, they shouldn't have been screwed up in the first place. It should have been
They're old,
implemented
right?
correctly.
They're old.
So if you have, the counties will tell you, we actually had to add more people in this checking to try to do some of it manually because the state systems are so screwed up. So we need people who understand how you transform and lead a IT or technology deployment so it doesn't go off the rails and become incompetent or technology malpractice. And that's the kind of leadership we need. And frankly, the current administration didn't do that.
Jeff Johnson.
So, Mike, I agree with Tim on the waste and fraud. It's preposterous when you look at the incompetence that we've seen and some of the fraud that's going on. But we can't claim that that is going to allow us to do massive tax cuts or real tax reform. We actually have to be honest and say we're going to have to reduce spending, not slow down its growth, as we saw during Tim's term, but actually reduce spending. And I know that's hard. I know how difficult it is. I know what the Democrats do to us when we suggest that anything should be less than it is now. But we have to do it. And I've been talking about that. And it's one of the reasons that I believe we should structurally put into our state system an auditing process. So we are constantly auditing at least the bigger programs, our human services programs, to determine not whether they're wasting money or whether there's fraud, but to determine whether they're actually producing results. Are they actually moving people long-term to self-sufficiency? Because those are the programs that every Minnesotan will support. But the ones that maybe have become a crutch or the ones that make us feel good as politicians, those are the ones that most Minnesotans, if you can make the case, would be happy to stop funding.
Let me ask you a question, Tim Pawlenty, because you mentioned ineligible people receiving benefits, and you have a TV commercial about that, and it shows pictures of a guy with a sign that says open borders and people climbing over the border wall, apparently. We had a question from a listener who said, why do you bring up immigration and refugee resettlement, both of you, as part of your campaigns? Isn't that a federal issue? Why spend so much time on that? This puts all immigrants under a cloud of suspicion. Well, how do you respond to that, Tim?
Political correctness leads to bad decisions. You got to make decisions based on real facts and real data and connect that to your head and your heart and hopefully your mouth as well. But the reason that those images are in the ad is because the legislative auditor report indicated that part of the problem in terms of the lack of eligibility for these public programs that I discussed just a moment ago were people who were here illegally or whose legal status couldn't be verified. So that's a legitimate aspect of this concern that I'm expressing. And beyond that, we should be for legal immigration, but you have to have your head in the sand to not realize that the country is facing a crisis in terms of illegal immigration. And we need to, crack down on illegal immigration and enforce our laws or improve our laws so that it is legal and reasonable and orderly. And for people to say it's not a legitimate topic or it's not something you should debate in the public square, that's ridiculous. It's one of the most pressing issues facing our country. So with all due respect to the listener, the idea that we can't bring up concerns about illegal immigration or its impact on our public safety or its impact on our public programs is ridiculous. I mean, why would you rule that out? It's a legitimate public policy concern and issue, and public leaders should address it.
Jeff Johnson, do you run the risk of casting blame or shame on all immigrants?
No, not if you discuss it in an honest and reasonable way. And I think this is one of the bigger problems we have in society right now. There are certain political issues that you're not even allowed to talk about anymore unless you fall on one side of the spectrum, which tends to be the left side of the spectrum. This is one of them. I've been pretty out front on the issue, not just of illegal immigration. I think there's broad agreement on that one, but on the issue of refugee resettlement. And I've talked about it in a way that I think is very caring and reasonable, and saying that we have a lot of wonderful success stories about refugee resettlement in the past, but in the last last several years, we've had a lot of people in this state raise real concerns about the costs of it, and we are seeing a lot of our newer refugees, they're not achieving the American dream. They're not working. And so rather than continuing to bring more refugees in, maybe we should stop that program, and that's what I would advocate we do to the administration, and start making sure that the refugees who are here are working and are moving towards the American dream. And the response I get to that, the vile response to that, about not just calling me names like racist or white supremacist, that happens, we know that, but some of the horrible things people say about you and your family in trying to shut down the discussion so that we can't even talk about it, it's really sad, and we've got to get past that. And it's, I'm going to do that as governor. We need to be able to talk about things in a rational way where we're not screaming names at each other anymore.
Another question from a listener for our candidates, Jeff Johnson and Tim Pawlenty, who are competing for the Republican nomination in the primary. It's conceivable that the U.S. Supreme Court in the next few years will give states more power to regulate abortion. What would you do as governor to change state law on abortion? And Tim Pawlenty, start with you again.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm pro-life, and I have taken steps as a public servant and leader in the state of Minnesota to advance and actually accomplish things that wisely and legally and safely reduce the number of abortions in our state. So that would include something called the Women's Right to Know, which was sort of a disclosure requirement. There's also something called the Positive Alternatives to Abortion that we put through, which tried to give people more information about the possibility of adoptions if they would prefer to do that. And so those were legal, reasonable, and while they were somewhat controversial, they weren't particularly controversial. So we want to work together to try to reduce the number of abortions in our state so that we can do it in a safe, wise, and legal manner. I think the Supreme Court speculation, the idea that this one change in justice is going to change abortion law anytime soon in our country is quite speculative. In fact, most legal experts would say it's not going to change the court balance. But even if it did now or in the future, you have to keep in mind that Minnesota has its own Supreme Court decision on the books called Doe versus Gomez, which has recognized a fundamental right to abortion in Minnesota. And the 5 or so Dayton appointees on the Minnesota Supreme Court are all, liberals, and so they're not going to change that anytime soon. So we're really talking about what can be done to reasonably reduce the number of abortions in a wise and safe manner. I think both sides can agree on things like I just mentioned, but the abortion laws, at the federal level or state level, aren't going to change anytime soon in terms of the Supreme Court's decision. That may change over time at the Supreme Court level in the U.S., but again, in Minnesota, the court's already locked in Minnesota's view on that, and unless you get a majority on the Minnesota Supreme Court, which again is 5 of 7 Dayton appointees, and that is not likely to happen.
Jeff Johnson. The issue of abortion.
Yeah, so I'll actually answer the question. I am pro-life as well, and if a bill comes to me that I believe is constitutional that restricts abortion further than it is right now, I would absolutely support it and sign it. There are things short of Roe v. Wade being overturned that we possibly could do in the state of Minnesota, having to do with taxpayer-funded abortions, which I think is actually a bipartisan issue if you talk to people around the state. But I am not afraid to say that if the constitutional law does change, I would support, for example, the sort of heartbeat bill that we saw pass in Iowa that is now in the courts and very likely isn't constitutional under Roe v. Wade.
So abortion would be banned as soon as a heartbeat
once you could hear a heartbeat. It'd be a little hard to make the argument that that's not a living human being if you can actually hear the heartbeat.
Doesn't that Minnesota court decision require that taxpayer money be spent on abortions?
Doe versus Gomez does broadly, but I think that there are probably things you could do to address that legislatively.
Tim Pawlenty, any response?
I said my response earlier, and I think Jeff and I are both pro-life, but you got to operate within the law and do it in a way that's wise and legal. And so, again, the things that I mentioned earlier, I think were helpful in reducing the number of abortions in our state. But the idea that somehow this issue is going to be fundamentally changed in the next, 5 to 7 years, I think is at the federal level is speculative, and again at the state level even more so.
All right, let me go to another listener question. It's about the opioid epidemic. It says, what will you do to fight it? Will you approach it from a treatment point of view or from a law enforcement point of view? And Jeff Johnson, let's start with you on that one.
I think you have to address it from both points of view, both a treatment and a law enforcement point of view and an education point of view. I actually, one of the bills that I chief authored when I was in the legislature was an anti-meth bill that the governor signed, and it became the model across the country for the most comprehensive anti-meth legislation that had passed in the country at that point. And the reason we were able to get it through, even though some people didn't love it, was because we addressed all the different areas rather than just one of them. We talk a lot, I think a lot of people assume that the opioid epidemic is just about prescription drugs, but heroin is actually a larger part of the opioid epidemic, and that becomes a law enforcement issue along with a treatment issue. And let me just add this, too. There actually was a bipartisan, not solution to this, but a step in the right direction towards addressing the opioid crisis that ended up on the cutting room floor because every session seems to end in this same chaos, and the governor vetoed a bill, including something that both sides agreed on. That can't happen year after year after year any longer.
Tim Pawlenty.
The opioid crisis is hurting and in some cases destroying lives and families across Minnesota and across our country, and we need to be aggressive about addressing it. And it is both a law enforcement and a chemical dependency and addiction issue. So it's going to be an all-hands-on-deck approach. Some of the things that we need to do to combat it include the following. One is we need to hold the pharmaceutical companies to account who for years have been prescribing these medicines and marketing them in a way that understated or masked their addictive powers. And they also encouraged through marketing practice the overprescribing of opioids in ways that I think were very damaging to individuals, patients, and communities. That's going to get all flushed out in the course of some litigation that's pending nationally. So as governor, I would say to the pharmaceutical companies, you're going to pay to help clean up your share of this mess. And there's a number of ways you can do that, but you're going to pay us now, you're going to pay later, but you're going to pay something. And there's a number of ways we can do it. You can pay in the litigation, or you can work with us constructively to pay. Beyond that, we need more treatment. We need more training in terms of the first responders in dealing with these issues. We're also going to need to understand that, as Jeff just mentioned, it's not just about prescription drugs. It's about the illegal drug trade, a lot of it coming from Mexico and China. Some of it, a big chunk of it is heroin, but increasingly fentanyl is being laced into certain other drugs. And there is a very noticeable, detectable pattern of how these drugs get here. And nationally, I would say to the Chinese and to the Mexicans, the Mexican government, look, we got a lot of trade issues and a lot of border issues, one of which is you better stop sending this junk into our country because you haven't seen problems with us unless you crack down not just on dumping certain trade products into our country, but the discussion around how we treat each other is now going to be extended to how you dump illicit and damaging drugs into our country as well. So I would be an advocate for a much stronger national voice as it relates to China and Mexico and some other places on those issues. And then we got to get tough on the drug dealers and the drug runners. Again, not a lot of the users are just addicts, and that's sad. And so we want to. A lot of times we just got to deal with it at the addiction level. But if you're a big time, drug runner and you're running drugs up from Mexico through Denver into Southwest Minnesota and into the Twin Cities, we need to make sure that we have a very concentrated, resourced, and capable team combating that.
Well, as long as you bring up national issues, let's talk about President Trump. And Tim Pawlenty, let me start with you. Have you asked for President Trump's endorsement or support? And if so, what was the answer?
Well, I've got to win the primary. I think they're looking to see who wins the primary. That's, less than 2 weeks from now. And so I'm hopeful and confident that we can win the primary, and then the administration will formally get involved in this race. President Trump, by the way, his record has got many, many, many great qualities to it. So, I like the fact that he's cutting taxes. I like the fact that he's strong on defense. I like the fact that he's getting tough with China. And I like the fact that he's getting tough with Mexico. I like the fact that he wants market-based, not government-based health care. I like the fact that he supports our law enforcement and police officers rhetorically and as a matter of public policy. I like the fact that he's cracking down on illegal immigration. So I agree with most of his policy positions. As I've expressed in the past, sometimes I don't always agree with his style and his language. I said some negative things about him. So did Jeff. And so we're both sort of in the same boat in that regard.
Jeff Johnson, have you asked for the president's endorsement, and has he responded?
Yeah, I haven't asked for his endorsement, but I've made it very clear that I would welcome his endorsement and his help in this race, and I support the president. I don't agree with everything he says or does. We have different styles about us, but I think he is absolutely trying to take the country in the right direction. I disagree with Tim when he says we're kind of in the same boat because we both had critical things to say before the election. The critical things I had to say were in pointing out to people why I was actually going to vote for him in the election. I said, hey, I've got these concerns about the guy, but I'm going to vote for him because he's a far better choice than Hillary Clinton. Tim said a few weeks before the election he's unhinged and he's unfit to be president, and I'm withdrawing my support. And said I actually voted for him. There's a big difference there, because one was saying, essentially giving Republicans permission to either not vote or to vote for Hillary Clinton, which I think our country would be in a much worse position if she were president right now. And the others of us was saying, yeah, I got these concerns because I try to be an honest guy, but I'm supporting him because he's a far better option.
Well, to be blunt about it, Jeff called him a jackass. And, so, there you have it.
And wait, let me explain that, because a comment was made that some people, you're supporting him, but some people have called him a jackass. And I said, if I have the choice between a jackass and a dishonest, corrupt politician, meaning Hillary Clinton, I'll take the jackass. Once again, maybe it's more colorful language than I should have used. I do that sometimes. But it was in the context of, I'm supporting the guy even if I have concerns about him. Big difference between saying that and saying he is unfit to be president and you essentially shouldn't vote for him.
All right, what about his approach to tariffs and trade? Are you on board there?
When I say that I have some differences with him, this would be one of them. I'm more of a free trader than he is. And I love the fact that he is trying to get better deals, because I agree with him that we got some raw deals. But I don't support tariffs. So my hope is that he will be, that he will be successful in getting a better deal. But if we move towards tariffs, I just think that is a bad thing across the board for the country.
Tim Pawlenty.
Yeah, jumping back to the Trump thing for a minute. So in Jeff's explanation, President Trump was a jackass before he became Jeff's hero.
No, that's not true at all, Tim. Did you listen to what I just said?
I did.
Okay, well, maybe you should actually repeat it the same way rather than saying something completely different.
I just summarized it for the listeners.
I supported him. You told people not to vote for him.
You called him a
difference.
jackass.
And I said,
and now he's your hero.
Yeah.
And so, and I appreciate and respect what he's doing as well. But to put the full record on, I voted for President Trump.
But you thought he was unfit to be president.
And I reacted to the Access Hollywood tapes. But, the idea that you were somehow, after you supported Marco Rubio, after you supported Ted Cruz, and then you begrudgingly got on the Trump campaign. By the way, I was helping President Trump during his campaign before I got mad about the Access Hollywood tape. To say that somehow, you calling him a jackass is better than me calling him, unhinged. I mean,
well, I have a question for you.
Come on, Jeff.
You said he was unfit to be president, and you were withdrawing your support a few weeks before the election. So on election night, when you were watching the coverage, who did you want to win?
Yeah, so I voted for President Trump before in early voting. But again, I support President Trump's policies. I don't like his.
But who did you want to win on election night?
I absolutely wanted President Trump to beat Hillary Clinton.
Even though you said he was unfit to be president,
I voted for him.
And you weren't supporting him.
I voted for him.
Then you should have told people that after you told them not to vote for him.
Okay, I don't want to be a jackass, but let me
You're not.
jump in here. What about tariffs? What about the tariffs and the trade issue?
Yeah, I think Jeff summarized it well in that regard. We want to be tough with the Chinese. We don't want to be tough with our Minnesota farmers. And so the Chinese cheat. A lot of other countries cheat as well, and we need a president who's going to stand up after a lot of decades of rhetoric and get tougher with trade partners who cheat. But as you do that, you got to actually get a better deal before the negative effects of that battle settles in on people like our Minnesota soybean growers. And so I applaud the president's efforts as this is unfolding to try to get some transitionary or temporary relief to the farmers in the form of this $12 billion package that his Department of Agriculture, one of the agencies, announced a week or so ago. That will provide some help. It doesn't make our farmers in Minnesota whole. And it's not just our soybean farmers. We've got other farmers and egg producers as well as our state who are hurting because of this. So again, we should be tough with the Chinese. We can't get tough with our farmers. They're already hurting in many ways. So I'm hoping that the president can get the better deal and get that finalized before the negative effects settle in any worse way for our Minnesota farmers.
Let me go to another question we had from a listener. What is government's role in expanding the housing supply for workers, people with low income, seniors, and others who are having trouble finding a place to live? Jeff Johnson, how about you?
I don't think the government has a role personally in owning housing. I think that is for the private sector, but I do believe there are a lot of programs in the state right now that offer incentives, especially in areas of high growth throughout the state where workforce housing is needed. And I think those incentive programs, as long as we are measuring to make sure they're effective, are reasonable. I also think the government has a role in this area and many others to not make it worse. And here is an area where government has made a problem much worse because of the regulations we have, because of some of the requirements that are at both the state level and local level. We know that it costs a lot more to build a moderate home in Minnesota than it does in North Dakota or South Dakota or Iowa or Wisconsin. And government needs to step back and actually not make problems worse. They do this with the daycare issue as well. We're wringing our hands that there aren't enough daycare providers in greater Minnesota. Well, the Department of Human Services is regulating many of them out of business.
Tim Pawlenty.
Yeah, I think Jeff makes good points on this issue here. The housing market in Minnesota is more expensive than comparable surrounding markets, and there's one housing advocacy group that believes, or several I believe, that housing is 20% or more expensive in Minnesota than in Wisconsin. And if you spend some time driving around Wisconsin, their houses do not appear to be, on average, worse off than the ones in Minnesota. So what's under the hood of why housing is so much more expensive in Minnesota? And part of the answer to that is you have local and state requirements, while well-intentioned in terms of safety, that sometimes are outdated or overburdensome. And you may be able to loosen up some of that and create a more affordable housing market in the state of Minnesota. There's also some other things that are taking place in greater Minnesota that we need to keep an eye on and try to help with. And we already spend a lot of money on housing in the state. The Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, for example, does things like buy up mortgages for first-time home buyers. They become the bundler and securitizer. That's what the FHA does. And so I think a discussion is as to the current money we spend on housing, can some of that be redeployed to, for example, a higher use, which is greater Minnesota affordable housing, rental housing and the like, and especially if some of the functions of the MHFA are duplicating what some of the federal agencies are doing.
Another question from a listener who said, I know and respect both Jeff and Tim. Many Republicans are frustrated by this damaging battle, and we've heard today it is a battle. Why not honor the party endorsement? And Tim Pawlenty, why not?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is, for me, I announced my campaign in April, which was just a month or so before the party endorsing convention, and we thought it was late to get in the race. Jeff will say yes, but as a former governor, you didn't need much time to get ready for the convention. He's run twice before for statewide office, and including last time as governor. And we didn't think that was enough time to properly prepare for the convention. But also, perhaps more importantly, or as importantly, we need to open up the process. At the peak of the voting at the Duluth Republican Convention, I think there were 800 or 900 votes cast for Jeff as the endorsed Republican candidate at the convention. When we have a primary in 10 days or so, we hope that there'll be well over 200,000 Minnesotans voting in that process. They'll still be the activists. They'll still be some of the most motivated Republicans in the state. But what that does is it allows everyday people who may have difficult schedules, family obligations, work obligations to participate, to have their voices heard more easily and in a more user-friendly and available way. It opens up the process. A lot of people just can't afford the time or the money to drive to Duluth, sit through a 3-day convention, pay for the meals, go to all the caucuses and meetings leading up to the state convention. It's a great process. We honor and respect the people who can do that. But when at the peak of the voting, you only get 800 or 900 people weighing in, I think it's better to have a more open process to decide who the parties want for their candidate. And that's how you get on the ballot in Minnesota. You represent your party by winning a primary.
Jeff Johnson?
Well, there were actually a couple thousand people at the state convention, and I won by acclamation.
But how many voted for you at the peak of the voting?
By acclamation?
No, how many
2,000.
recorded votes for you, Jeff?
Tim, I won by acclamation. Do you get that or not? Apparently you don't. And you say it's a great process, but you've said we should essentially eliminate it. You question whether we should even have conventions anymore. To me, this is about many thousands of the most active, engaged Republicans in the state. And we need them if we want to win in November. If we're going to thumb our nose at them and say, you really don't matter, and maybe we shouldn't even have this process anymore, these are the folks who pound in the lawn signs and knock on the doors and walk in parades and stuff envelopes for us. And we've got hundreds of them working on this campaign across this state, maybe thousands of them, which I think is the difference between winning and losing. But if we think we can win in November by essentially pushing aside the most active Republicans in the state, I think we're crazy.
And I'm not arguing for pushing them aside. I'm just saying not everybody can participate in that process, either because of time or budget or circumstance. And so the party process continues as an important piece of the process, but it shouldn't be necessarily the final or only word. And to have 200,000 activists, grassroots people and more participate is better than even using Jeff's numbers, 1,000 or 2,000.
I said I would let you go at 1:45 as part of this process, but I want to give you each about 30 seconds to sum it up, make your last pitch here to the voters. Jeff Johnson, why should they pick you on August 14th?
If you are looking for fundamental change to government, if you are looking to change the culture in our state government, particularly our state agencies, from that of controlling and directing and telling everybody else how to live their lives or farm their land or run their business, I am the candidate who will bring that. Tim Pawlenty, if you look at his 8 years, I think you'll see business as usual, more of the same, some good things, but no fundamental change. I think people in Minnesota, regardless of party, are looking for some disruption in a system that's become completely broken.
Closing argument, Tim Pawlenty.
Again, thank you to MPR for hosting this and for Jeff for this spirited discussion, and I look forward to more of it in the coming days before the primary. One of the main reasons I'm running for governor is the future of Minnesota, if it's left to the Democrats, will include higher taxes. It will include runaway spending way beyond the growth of family budgets or the private economy. It will include the government takeover of healthcare. It will include looking the other way on illegal immigration. It will include school funding, but no school reform and accountability, and I think that's critically important. It will include continued government-centric approaches to all the problems in people's lives. And I don't believe in that. I believe in a future for Minnesota that is brighter and better based on the private sector, on individual responsibility, individual accountability, and I've delivered that as governor before. And we want to make sure that we have a future that is bright and promising, but not led by what I'd call the Bernie Sanders or liberal view of how government interacts with people.
Tim Pawlenty and Jeff Johnson, the Republican candidates for the nomination in the primary on August 14th. If you haven't voted yet, remember to do it on August 14th. Thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's take a break now for a news update. Stephen John is here. Hi, Stephen.